to turn to John 17. And while you're turning, I got a picture that I saw this past week that I wanted to share with you. This is the Triumphant Church of God, located at 1778 Nostrand Avenue in the Brooklyn part of New York City. Now, as soon as I saw this picture, I wanted to know more information. Unfortunately, I came up empty. The Triumphant Church of God doesn't seem to have much of an online presence, right? There's no website. There's no Google reviews. There's not even a Facebook page, at least that I could find, where they live stream the sermons. When I first saw this picture, there were two things about it that struck me. The first was the name, the Triumphant Church of God. I don't know why that's so cool to me, but I mean, who wouldn't want to be a part of a church that's triumphant, right? And then the second thing was the location. And to get a better sense of location, I've got another picture I'm going to show you that's a drone shot of this part of New York City. So somewhere in there, on this little side street, is the Triumphant Church of God. Also in the picture, if you could zoom in, you could see these places, are all of these cultural landmarks, shall we call them. The Empire State Building, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York Stock Exchange, the world's most famous arena, outside of Rupp Arena, Madison Square Garden. They are all within walking distance of the Triumphant Church of God. These are the places where tourists come literally every year, millions of tourists from all over the world to come and see these places. And yet, while I can't prove this, I would almost guarantee you that most of the people that live in the neighborhood around Nostrand Avenue probably have no idea what the Triumphant Church of God is, or if it's even active and why it's even there. And sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes you have these cultural landmarks, where the architecture is amazing, where the lights are bright and the money is flowing, and where people travel from all over the world, the most beautiful people, the most powerful people, and they gather in these places to celebrate how beautiful and how powerful they are, while over here on like this side street, in a little makeshift building with a hand-painted sign, you've got a little group of like-minded people who gather together week after week to worship a God that they cannot see and have a hard time explaining. John 17, we're going to be in week 3 of our series that we call The Elephant in the Room. And one of the things that came up during this survey that Austin sent out is how does the church relate to the culture around it? How do you reconcile, a little group of people in a storefront building with all of these cultural institutions that were in walking distance? One of the top vote getters, I said in the little survey, was how we're to reconcile those two pictures. And just so you know, this is not a new question. All the way back in 1951, there was a guy named Richard Niebuhr. I've got a picture of him, who wrote a classic book titled Christ in Culture. Just as a side note, it was Richard Niebuhr's brother, Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote the Serenity Prayer that we use in Celebrate Recovery and also in other, AA and other addiction recovery groups. So when we were having our twins, there was a part of me that wanted to name them Richard and Reinhold. But Jamie vetoed that, so we went with Jack and Andrew. But in his book, he talks about the 5 different ways that the church can relate to the culture. And it's an interesting book. If you're interested in that kind of thing, I hope you'll buy the book. But rather than getting lost in sort of the philosophical, academic questions about this, I want us this morning to focus on some of the real-life issues that all of us face as we try to navigate the complexity of life in 2024. So however you want to think about it, the issue of how the church relates to the culture is a philosophical question with profound practical implications. And here's what I mean by that. Like, it's one thing to sit in a classroom and debate how this works. It's something different when you're a parent sitting around your kitchen table and you're trying to decide, like, should I send my kids to public school, a private Christian school, or should I do my best to homeschool them? And what about voting? Like, as followers of Jesus, are we only supposed to vote for people that are also Christians? And what happens when we find out the person that we were going to vote for is a Christian, but they're part of a church that believes so much differently than we believe that it's hard to see how those two things fit together? What do you do? What do you do then? I saw an article recently, and someone took actor Alan Ritchson. He plays Jack Reacher on Amazon Prime's popular series Reacher, and they took him to task for for claiming to be a committed Christian while playing in R-rated movies. Is that okay? And what about watching those kind of movies? Like, if that's out, then a lot of us are in big trouble. And what about listening to music? Like, as Christians, are we only supposed to listen to K-Love, or is it okay to listen to other things? When your kids get older, is it okay for your kids to go to a public state university where everything they believe is going to be attacked over and over again, or is everybody supposed to go only to Bible college? And as hard as those questions are, they don't even register with some of the hot-button cultural topics, things like immigration, transgenderism, homosexuality, the death penalty, the welfare state, IVF, abortion, and so many other things that you see every time you turn on the news or scroll through social media. How are we as Christians supposed to think about those things? And maybe even more importantly, what are we supposed to do, and how are we supposed to relate to people who think much differently on those things than we do? So as we jump into this, I want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer. Even though it's true that in the next few weeks we're going to address some of these issues a little more in depth, there is no possible way for me or anybody else to answer all of your questions and address every possible scenario. In fact, just to be honest with you, I have a hard time working through some of my own questions. But what I do hope to do is give you some guiding principles that you can apply on your own as you try to make decisions that may be helpful to you. Now, in Dr. Niebuhr's book, as I said, he gives you 5 options for how this works, and then underneath each of those options, he gives 4 or 5 like sub-options or subcategories, which I think make his book overly complicated. But again, if you're into that sort of thing, buy his book and read it. For our purposes this morning, though, I want to tell you about 3 popular options that a lot of churches and a lot of Christians have taken, and then give you what I think is a better and more biblical option. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first option. It's the option of withdrawal. So as Christians, there are some churches who have chosen in their desire to be loyal to Christ and try to avoid being contaminated by what they call worldly influences. There are some Christians who have tried to withdraw as much as possible from the culture around them. Good example of this would be the Amish. More locally would be the Mennonites. There's some like hyper-legalistic, hyper-fundamentalist churches that have done this. And there may be like points because of their business interest where they intersect with the culture around them. But for the most part, they've done everything they can do to withdraw from the world around them. Sometimes as a part of their efforts, these groups will even set up alternative cultures or alternative worlds. We call them bubbles, where they only interact with each other. So rather than going to school, they start their own schools. Rather than listening to what's on the radio, they start their own radio stations. They listen to their own radio. They have their own publishing houses. They produce their own curriculum. And everything they do, it stays inside the bubble, and it reinforces the worldview that they hold. Some of you may have grown up in environments like that, where it was like it was us and it was them, and everybody who wasn't a part of us was part of them, and so we couldn't relate to them because they weren't part of us. And that's the approach a lot of people take. A second option that seems to be growing in popularity, especially with a certain sector, is the idea of a hostile takeover. Some people have decided, a lot of times you'll see this play out in the political arena. People say we need to use our political power, our votes, to vote for people who believe like we do and who promise to enact the things that we want them to enact, and will punish anybody who does anything that doesn't fit with what we believe. If you grew up in the 80s like I did, there was all this talk about the culture war. And we've got to use our voting power to put people in who are going to do what we want them to do. And then over time we discovered that most people disagree with us. And so it's kind of hard to do that. And then so what's happened in more recent years is that's led some people to become disillusioned with the whole process, and so they withdraw. Other people become desperate with the process, and they're working that much harder to take over what they think is a culture gone astray. The third option, this is another one that's grown in popularity, is the option of surrender. This is the old, if you can't beat them, join them approach. There's some churches, and we can name them, who in an attempt to be accepted by the culture around them have abandoned everything they historically believed, and they've adopted whatever beliefs seem to be popular at the moment, even if those beliefs change. If you listen closely to a lot of these churches, you'll discover that they rarely, if ever, talk about the gospel, but they spend an awful lot of time talking about whatever the hot button issue is at that time. So this month, it's a sermon series on climate change, followed by a Tuesday night lecture series on economic inequality. And next month, it'll be something different. And what you'll find, if you pay attention to those churches that have surrendered to the culture, is nobody is ever made uncomfortable. Bold stands are never taken. And the primary emphasis seems to be on unity, often at the expense of truth. And those are kind of the three big categories. Some people have chosen to withdraw. Other people have chosen to try and take over the culture. And then there's a lot of people, an increasing number of people, who have surrendered to the culture. But I think there's a better option and a more biblical option, and that's what I call missional engagement. John 17, what you find is what's called the high priestly prayer of Jesus, which was offered on the Thursday night that he was arrested. So this is praise in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's separated himself from the crowd. He's trying to prepare himself for what he knows is about to happen. The soldiers are going to swoop in with Judas. They're going to arrest him. He's going to go stand trial, and the next morning he'll be crucified. So as he prepares himself spiritually and emotionally for what he knows is about to happen, we get this opportunity to listen in as he talks to his Father. And if you read through John 17, it's so cool. It can be divided into three parts. So like in the first part, Jesus prays for himself, and he prays that his Father would give him the strength he needs to fulfill his mission. Then you get to the last part, and he prays for us. He prays for all of us in the future who would believe in him because of the testimony of the apostles. But in between those two sections, there is this part where Jesus prays for his disciples, the guys who were still with him, who left everything to follow him, and who he knows are going to have a target on their back because of their association with him. And so as he prays, in the first part, he prays that they would be protected because he knows the same people that have come after him are eventually going to come after them. But then you get to verse 13, and there's this shift, and he stops praying that they would be protected, and he starts to pray that they would be effective in what they've been called to do. I want you to listen to this with me. John 17, verse 13. I am coming to you now, but I say these things while I am still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within them. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer, and catch this so good, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. Now there's a phrase that comes out of verse 16. That's kind of the big idea for the morning. It perfectly captures this attitude that we're supposed to have. And that's that as followers of Jesus, we are in the world, meaning we live here, but we're not of the world. So Jesus doesn't pray, as you go through this, Jesus never prays that his Father would take his disciples out of the world, even though he knew they were going to be living in a very dangerous environment because they were going to be surrounded by people who not only disagreed with them, but who hated them. So Jesus says, Father, would you protect these guys who, because of their association with me, are going to have a target on their back? Jesus knew that within just a few hours, he was going to be crucified. He also knew that after he was gone, the same people who had orchestrated his death were going to shift their attention from him to the guys who were closely identified with him. I mean, if there was ever a time for people to withdraw from society and go into hiding, this was the moment. And yet Jesus never praised that. Instead, he praised that God would give them the ability not to withdraw from the culture, not to take over the culture, and not to surrender to the culture, but to lovingly and carefully engage the culture. Question is, how do you do that? Especially in a complex world like we live in 2024. Three sort of guiding principles hopefully will be helpful. Here's the first one. As followers of Jesus, whatever we do, we should engage, we should live with a deep sense of joy. That's number one. Verse 13, Jesus prayed, I am coming to you now, but I say these things while I'm still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within them. The them in this statement is, of course, the disciples. And so Jesus knows he's leaving, and he knows they're going to be left to live and survive in a world in which everybody around them is against them because of what they believe and who they represent. And yet, the thing that he prays that they would experience is joy. Rather than giving in to the natural resentment and anger that comes from living in a world that's aligned against you, Jesus said, I want you to live with joy. One thing that's so jarring when you read through the New Testament is that Jesus never displayed his anger towards the people that you think he would be angry with. Instead, he always displayed his anger against the religious people. Like you read through, you think, who's Jesus? He's angry at the prostitutes and the thieves and the Roman political leaders, but it was not that. He always engaged with those people in a way that drew them in rather than push them away, and it was the religious leaders who he was angry with. You say, why would he do that? He did that because there's something about joy that Jesus knows attracts people rather than repels them. So with that in mind, let me ask you a question. If the people closest to you had to choose one word, and you gave them the options, would they describe you as a more joyful Christian or an angry Christian? Which would it be? Think about the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis. Or think about the people that you live with. Would they describe you as angry or joyful? Now, if you're one of those people that in a moment of transparency would say something like, you know what, I'm angry, but I'm only angry because of what they're doing and the way things are, then you need to know that the disciples lived in a world in which everything was aligned against them. Everybody was opposed to them. And the first thing Jesus prayed is that they would be protected. And the second thing is that they would be joyful. If you know their story, all of the remaining disciples were either killed for their faith or exiled to live out their old age where they didn't want to be. And yet Jesus said, here's what I want you to have. I want you to have a deep sense of joy. And he prayed for that because he knew there's something about joy that draws people in rather than pushes them away. Now here's a second guiding principle. As followers of Jesus, we should live with a radical adherence to the truth. This is where it sometimes gets sticky. If you're a person who listens to a lot of radio, you may have heard about this transition that took place at NPR a few weeks ago. It was back in March. They hired a new CEO. I've got a picture of her. Her name is Catherine Marr. If you've listened to any of this, seen any media coverage, it's really been all over the place. But her selection as CEO has not been without controversy. It prompted one of their longest tenured editors to resign his position because of a TED Talk that Catherine Marr had given back in 2022 in which she espoused her philosophy of truth. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole speech. If you're interested, you can look it up. But there were a couple comments she made in that got a lot of attention. And I'm going to put them on the screen just so you know I'm not making this up. Here's one thing she said. She said, perhaps on our most tricky disagreements, seeking truth and seeking to convince others of the truth might not be the right place to start. In fact, our reverence for the truth might be a distraction that's getting in the way of finding common ground and getting things done. That was towards the beginning of the speech. A little later in the speech, she made another statement that's gotten a lot of attention when she said, I'm certain that the truth exists for you and probably for the person sitting next to you. But this may not be the same truth. That is because the truth of the matter is very often for many people what happens when we merge facts about the world with our beliefs about the world. So we all have different truths. They're based on things like where we come from, how we were raised, and how other people perceive us. Now keep in mind, this is not the comments of some existentialist philosopher from the 1960s. This is the CEO of one of the world's leading news organizations and a source from whom many people across the country get their news. Now compare what she said to what Jesus said in verse 17 when he prayed, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. To be sanctified means to be set apart, and Jesus instinctively knew that if his followers believed in the truth of who he was and did their best to live according to who he was and what he said, that they would be set apart, they would be distinct from the culture around them. That's especially true today when we live in an environment in which so many cultural leaders have bought into the lie that either the truth doesn't exist, and if it does, it's really nothing more than a distraction that pulls our attention away from the things that are more important. And just so you know, it's the philosophy behind what Catherine Marsh said is how you wind up living in an anything goes world. I mean, if everything is true, or if nothing is true, or if anything can be true, depending on a person's perspective, then nothing is out of bounds because all the lines have been erased. I've got another picture I want to show you. You may recognize this guy. This is Richard Dawkins. He is a leading bioethicist and researcher, biologist. For the last 30 years, he's also been the world's leading proponent of atheism. So you know anybody that's sort of a militant atheist, they've been reading his stuff. Back in 2006, he wrote a book, best-selling book titled The God Delusion, in which he tried to disprove the existence of God while also highlighting the dangers of organized religion. But in a recent interview just 3 weeks ago, he claimed that now, at the age of 83, he's come to appreciate the benefits of living in a primarily Christian culture. And he noted that historically, every time a society moves away from Christianity, they always embrace something worse. They never get better. It always gets worse. Now, here's what he said in the interview. He said, I do think we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there is a distinction between being a believing Christian and a cultural Christian. Listen to this part. He said, I think it would be truly dreadful if we substituted any alternative religion. For example, if I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I would choose Christianity every single time. Spoken by a guy that has spent his life trying to discredit Christianity. Colossians 1, the Apostle Paul, talking about Jesus, said this, for in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. But the opposite of that is also true. Apart from him, everything falls apart. And as you look around, and as you scroll through social media, you can see that happening in real time. That's why as followers of Jesus, as painful as it might sometimes be, our job is to live as best we can according to the truth of who Jesus is and what Jesus has said. Now, here's the last sort of guiding principle. As followers of Jesus, we should also have a deep commitment to the mission. I want you to go to verse 18 of John 17. Here's what he said. As you sent me, this is Jesus talking to his Father, as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. So verse 18, Jesus makes it clear that as his followers, we've been sent into the world to communicate the message of the gospel to people who desperately need to hear it. And that's why I think it's a mistake whenever we try to withdraw from the culture. Again, I know there's some dangers associated with that. I know there's some landmines that you have to avoid. But if you never place yourself in an environment where you're surrounded by people who are far from God and where you can build relationships with people who are far from God, then how in the world are you ever going to communicate the gospel and fulfill your mission? That's why earlier I used the phrase missional engagement. As followers of Jesus, there are certain places you've been sent, and there are certain people that you've been sent to for the sake of the mission. That's why in verse 19, Jesus said, if you're a follower of his, you've been sanctified, meaning you've been set apart. You have a distinct role to play in the ongoing evolution or de-evolution of our culture. What that means is, wherever you go, and whatever kind of environment you find yourself in, you're not there by accident. You're there for a purpose. So when you get up and go to work tomorrow, you're not going just to get a paycheck. You're there to build relationships with people who need a relationship with God. When you go to the ball game, right, and you're sitting in the stands watching your kids, you're not there to keep stats and yell at the umpires. You're there to be a light in a culture that's grown increasingly dark. When you go into your classroom, whether you're a teacher or student, you're not there to get better test scores. You're there to represent the truth in a world that's been overrun by lies. When you go to the store and you got your hat pulled down and your collar pulled up because you don't want to have to engage with anybody, you're not there just to get your groceries, man. You're there to radiate joy to everybody that comes in contact with you. That's why you're here. You've been sent. And as you keep reading in John 17, when you get to verse 20, Jesus transitions. He stops praying for the disciples and he prays for us. And he prays for us the same thing that he prayed for them. He prayed that we be protected and that we be effective. I want you to look at the last two verses in John 20. Jesus prays, righteous Father, though the world does not know you, I know you, and they know that you have sent me. I have made you known to them and will continue to make you known in order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them. Make sure you don't miss this. Jesus' prayer and his promise is that as we get to know him and as we work to make him known, he's promised to be with us as we try to do what he sent us to do. That means you really only have one option. According to Jesus, our mission as his followers is not to withdraw from the culture and go into hiding and just hang out with each other while the world around us disintegrates. It's not, and sometimes that sounds attractive, but that's not an option. He's also not called us to take over the culture and force everybody to believe what we believe and do what we want them to do, even if it's against their will. But he's also told us not to surrender to the culture and abandon everything we believe in order to be accepted by people who probably never accept us anyway. Instead, we've been sent into the world to do our best to engage with people who are far from God in hopes of helping them experience the grace and forgiveness that can only be found in a relationship with him. I told you earlier that one of the reasons I was so taken by the picture of that little that little church with the hand-painted sign, was because of the name of the church. To be triumphant means to be victorious. It means to win a battle, which is what we all want to be like. We want to be on the triumphant side. We want to be on the winning side. As I dug into that throughout the week, the more I thought about it, the more I dug in, I discovered that little church really was not all that triumphant. And the reason they don't have an online footprint in 2024 is because they closed at the end of 2021. I got another picture I want to show you that I took from a real estate website. You can actually buy the buildings so for $390,000. So if you're interested, you can write down the number. I'll give it to you after church. It's kind of hard to reconcile that picture, isn't it? This triumphant church of God closed its doors and is now for sale. While within walking distance of this little church, you've got all these cultural centers that just continue to thrive. And sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes it feels like, hey, the culture is just exploding. Everybody's sort of doing their own thing. Everybody's sort of thriving. And you got the church over here. And we're just sort of plodding along, doing our own thing, trying to survive. Now, let me show you another picture of a church I'm far more concerned about than I am the triumphant church of God. Most people have no idea what happens at 1778 Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn. But there are some people in this room and some people around us that have a vague notion of what happens at 100 Michigan Avenue in Monticello. What would it look like for our church to triumph in our community? What would it look like for us to win in our little community? I think it looks a lot like what Jesus said. It looks like people just like you and me living with a sense of joy that it makes no sense, that's almost indescribable to the people we come in contact with. And it looks like people like us lovingly but boldly standing for the truth, even when it costs us, even when there's people around us that don't understand it. But I think it also looks like people like us going into every environment in which we find ourselves for the express purpose of building relationships with people who are far from God so that we can lovingly share the truth of God's word and help them find their way back to God. That's what it looks like to win. But here's the deal. For us to win, for us to triumph, you have to triumph. Like the church is not the building, the church is the people. We talked about that Wednesday night. You know, here's the church and here's the steeple, and you open the door and there's the people. The church is the people. And so for us to win, you have to win. I want you to stand with me. If you're here this morning and you've never taken the first step in this process, which is to experience the grace and forgiveness that can only come from a relationship with God, we'd love to help you do that. We'd love to talk you through that process. We'd be honored to pray with you. David's here. I'll be up here. If you're ready to join the team here at FCC, become a part of what we're doing, as imperfect as we are, and we are deeply imperfect, we're doing our best to engage our community in a way that makes sense. If you'd like to be a part of that, place your membership here. We'd be honored to have you. If you need to do something, we're going to sing a couple songs. Leave your seat and meet me up here in this front row. We'll walk you through whatever you need to do.